Welcome back to Three Men and a Mystery. I'm one of the three men, John Lorton.
And this is Mike Morford.
And I'm Gray Hughes.
Welcome to the last pre-recorded episode of Season 2, Silenced, the Death of Elisa Gomez. We've spoken to a lot of experts and seen varying opinions. The physical evidence we reviewed last time with John Bishop is finally raising some interesting questions, but what about Elisa's mental state? Is it really a factor in her death? Today we're talking to not one, but two forensic psychologists. Let's welcome to the show Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott from the podcast LA Not So Confidential. Hello, we'll say Dr. Shiloh first. Hello, Dr. Shiloh.
Hi, how are you guys doing today?
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Scott, hello.
Hey guys, thanks for having us on. We appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. Well, of course, I think we should get started by hearing about your background and experience. Dr. Shiloh, you want to start?
Sure. So I was a police officer before I was a psychologist. I did 7 years as a sworn officer working primarily patrol. I was also a background investigator and a terrorism liaison officer with my department here in Southern California. While I was doing that, I decided to go back to school and get my doctorate. And I picked a forensic psychology program because I was actually planning at the time to continue in law enforcement. And I was thinking about going to the federal level. So I enrolled in school, ended up really loving what I was doing and studying. And by the time I got to internship where Dr. Scott and I met, I knew that that was the path that I was going to continue on. So I did a lot of my internship working with sex offenders and eventually specialized in sex offender treatment after graduation and did that for about 10 years. And about 3 years ago, I got the opportunity to put in for a job as a police psychologist and did that and have been loving it ever since, working for a major police department in Los Angeles.
Wow, that is really cool. And I love how you kind of found a unique cross-section of where your old career was and where you wanted to go with your new one, but still found that kind of point where they meet up against each other. And you're still helping to serve the public in a really interesting way. You're taking care of officers, right?
Yeah, it's definitely come full circle. I feel like I've lived 3 different lives already with everything that I've done and the careers that I've done so far. But yeah, a big part of my job is clinical services with police officers and providing therapy for them and their significant others. And then I also consult with command staff and different divisions, as well as being part of the crisis negotiation team.
Wow. Amazing. Dr. Scott, how about you? What do you have for a background and how did you come to this work?
Yeah, first, before I start yakking about myself, Dr. Shiloh is, she doesn't blow her horn as much as she should. And one of the things I would want to say about her being a law enforcement psych now is that with her law enforcement background, it raises the level of respect for the law enforcement that come to her for treatment. I mean, we work 3 or 4 blocks from each other, and she's at my office all the time. And whenever she walks in, the police are like the goddess has come back. She's really highly respected, but she doesn't blow her horn the way I do. But my story is, I was in entertainment for many years, a lot of different aspects. My last few years in entertainment was working as a casting director and then in post-production. And I was just it was a great, for anybody who has history in working in entertainment in Los Angeles is a harsh mistress. It's a lot of fun, but there's not a great deal of benefits or security in the job at all. And I was ready to make a transition. And I thought at the time I was just going to be, I was going to work at the master's level as a clinician, maybe like in private practice as a marriage and family therapist. And I got about halfway through my program and I was so turned on by getting back into education as an adult that I enrolled in the doctoral program, which was a clinical and forensic hybrid program. So the bulk of my training was in clinical psychology, but also in what we call family forensics, which was doing evaluations on court custodies and really understanding the court process. And when then Shiloh and I met up at our internship working in South LA with sex offenders, which was like an amazing experience for both of us, and where we connected as friends, and we've been friends ever since. But when I graduated, Shiloh stayed working at the agency we were at, and I went to work in the state prison for about 3 years. It was fantastic, and really I firmly married myself into the field of forensics. And I was commuting to and from Central California for that time period. And then after a while, I was ready to come back and settle in LA, where my partner and I live. And I ended up working at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, which is part of the Sheriff's Department jail downtown. Enormous facility, one of the largest correctional facilities in the country. And got a real chance to work, closely with people that were being brought in, just evaluation after evaluation, and really, just really took to the work. And then I was able to jump over to the position I'm at now, where I partner with law enforcement to go into the community to evaluate and mitigate risk with people that are escalating. Like when we get people that are frequent flyers, and because of our rubric of evaluating risk in the community, we realize, this person's really right on the cusp of really getting into trouble and really causing harm. And we go in and we evaluate the situation. It might result in a hospitalization. It might result in incarceration, or, developing a treatment plan to mitigate future risk.
I had no idea that they even had programs that were kind of that forward thinking and that forward looking. Is that a recent development, or have they had programs like that for a while?
We've been around for about 10 years, and basically the entire country is following suit.
Yeah.
We're very coy about saying what agencies we work with, and we want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
But we're real open about being in Southern California, and our largest mental health organization is really huge and really progressive and working with all of the local law enforcement. So the co-responder model is huge out here.
Yeah. Amazing. I imagine that this gives, just the experience that you're talking about from each of you gives you such unique insight when you're looking into cases, and you've got great experience to draw from. Can you tell us a bit more about LA Not So Confidential? When did it start?
Go ahead, Scott. You tell a story.
So Shiloh, just about 3 years ago, Shiloh had started in her law enforcement side position, and it was like a dream come true for our friendship. Our families spend a lot of time together. We're very close friends. It's ridiculous. Like, we finish each other's sentences in many ways, and we're on the same wavelength in so many things. And we met for lunch, and then went and grabbed coffee, and we were walking back to our respective offices, and Shiloh said, "I've got an idea." I was like, "What?" She goes, "I think we should do a podcast." And I was like, "No, we're not doing a podcast. We're not doing a podcast." And she goes, No, wait. There's no forensic psychology podcasts out there that are actually being done by forensic psychologists. There's a couple where people get on and they just read from Wikipedia, but there's nobody there that's actually doing the work that we do. And by the time we walked a quarter of a block of me going, no, Shiloh, we don't have time. We can't. What about we call it LA Not So Confidential? and then we bought a couple of mics off, a couple of Yeti mics, and figured out GarageBand, and it took off. And it took off in a way that we really weren't expecting. And we had some real serendipitous moments where a fan of ours who was on the My Favorite Murder discussion boards said, "Hey guys, if you like this, you should try out this podcast." And overnight, our numbers just went through the roof. It was crazy.
Our formula really was to talk about true crime but give forensic psychology input of what we really do and how it's really happening and how it differs from television shows, even though we love the media associated with it. And with Scott's background in entertainment, we thought, well, that's going to be an element too, is we're going to talk about all of the documentaries that we love to watch about it, or the TV or old Lifetime movie that has an example of it. Right. And so we thought that was a good way to weave in this casual nature that we wanted to bring to it with our friendship and the way that we sort of play off each other, by really just filling a void of nobody professionally in the field doing it yet.
I love that. And that's definitely a trend that we've seen over the past few years is, professionals now stepping up and kicking off their projects and giving people a whole different insight. Now we have people like Shiloh and we've got a private investigator that has worked on so many different cases, and she sees podcasts as another way to raise exposure to those cases and kick up a bunch of new tips and new information. I hope we see more of this with law enforcement, public information officers maybe coming forward and reaching out more to these venues and opening up a bit more, because I do think there's more great work to be done. Morph and myself were with the Crawl Space team at the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases, and we did a presentation specifically on social media and how we can help you investigators out there. And we need to figure out how to work together more to do that. So it's great to hear that.
I think it's an amazing cultural phenomena that's occurring. And the crowdsourcing of information works on so many levels, especially, Shiloh, we trade off. We don't have time to listen to everything. So Shiloh will go, hey, can you cover this one? And I'll cover this one. And, In the Dark season 2 is just mind blowing.
Yeah.
What those journalists have done. I mean, it's very slickly produced, but the idea that someone's life may be actually saved by crowdsourcing information is just, that's an amazing phenomenon to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I've always appreciated, is just the mentality behind that there's other people out there that care. And now you're making a network of those types of people and the great things that they can do. I know Gray had a great example where he wanted to raise money for the Doe Project. Is that right, Gray?
Yeah, it was the Summit County Doe. We raised $2,700 on just social media really quick, and we sent it to Summit County, and then they in turn contacted Colleen Fitzpatrick at the DNA Doe Project. And they're at the point right now where they've sent the DNA in for sequencing. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's great to see these real world things take effect. And, on my channel, the Lord and Arts channel on YouTube, I literally donate thousands of dollars every year to several different organizations and private GoFundMes of the cases that I'm looking into. So it's great that we have all these people that want to help.
It's great that there's experts like you out there to come on shows like ours and add some insight too, because you can't get that experience that you bring to the table. So I think more podcast is what we need.
It's interesting for us. We're happy to lend a little bit of what we know, but for us, it's fascinating. Elisa's case is just, it's hard to wrap your mind around, and there's so many questions and people are drawn to it. And so, we're getting something out of it and other people are getting something out of it too.
Yeah. You raise a really interesting point. So, getting a little bit closer to the topic, talking about Elisa Gomez, when you're working on a case, what type of materials do you usually review to come to determinations? And I'm talking more about from a forensic perspective. So maybe, I don't know, Dr. Scott, do you want to take that, or Dr. Shiloh, whichever way you guys want to go? Professionally,
we're not doing specific case consultation with law enforcement as part of our job. So on a regular basis, I should say, I do a little bit of consultation work on the outside where I have conducted a couple case files, and there are case studies, and it depends on what they're willing to give me and what the referral question is. So I've had a law enforcement agency say, hey, we think one of our own is acting inappropriately with an underage person, and we have all the text messages we want you to review. So here I was asked, basically, is there grooming behavior taking place? And, or do I think they've had sexual conduct? This was meaning one of their own law enforcement officers and a teenager. But all I was given were just these pages and pages of text messages. And from that, what I did was illustrated where I thought there was grooming behavior being exhibited. And it was kind of a crapshoot for me to be able to say whether or not they were having sexual contact, because that wasn't explicitly in there. But again, it's my opinion, and they're going to do what they're going to do with that. Another case, I've been asked to, there's a missing person, and I was asked to hear from family members, to look at some documents, to examine his medical history, to say whether or not I thought he was suicidal. And I really did think that he was, and it turned out weeks, if not months later, they found his remains up in the hills where he had basically gone for a walk. And they don't know if he died from the elements or if it was suicide, because his body had been there so long. So there are some very small cases that I do a little bit of consultative work, and it's totally different. You know, whatever they're willing to give me to look at. If they're not giving me enough and the referral question is too big, then I'll tell them that I don't have enough to be able to answer what you're asking me.
Yeah, there's a real level of responsibility that you have there. I mean, you can't send them off in a totally wrong direction because you just want to, clear the file from your desk or something ridiculous like that. So
Shiloh, from her perspective, she gave what she does. In my job, there's a little bit more of it. And I work with a threat management unit as well as the division I work with. And at any time, we might be looking at a person's, very long, broad history of mental health issues. And if it's somebody that, especially in Southern California, we have a number of people who are mentally ill, who come here from all over the world, that are convinced they're married to Kim Kardashian or they're married to Leonardo DiCaprio, because we have celebrities from A level to Z level, and, mental illness can make you obsessed on them. And we will, I'll be asked to say, hey, in this case, what would you call this? And I'll explain, I'll say, well, look, this person has an erotomatic fixation on this person, and this is a risk factor. But it's, so we work with what material we have. And sometimes you're working with very little material and you're theorizing. So you're saying, if in this situation, this could possibly happen, but I'm flying blind. So this might happen, this might not happen. It's not like we laughed in our first few episodes. Shiloh and I kind of made the joke about Getty Watanabe in Law and Order, who kind of always, as the forensic psychologist at the police station, always kind of wraps things up really easily and quickly and neatly. And it never works that way in real life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like, you're considering medical history, but you're also talking about kind of social information if they're focusing on specific celebrities and stuff. So social media, I imagine, plays a part in that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me ask you a question. Forensic psychologists are, it seems like they're very similar to a profiler. What's the difference there? Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. We get this question all the time, and I've done a fair amount of supervising students and interns, and everyone wants to be a profiler. And so, and I did too at one point. So I know where they're coming from and what a reality check it is to know that there are not that many profilers in this world. And there are not many at all who are also psychologists. So the majority of the profilers in this country work for the behavioral analysis unit in the FBI, and they're special agents. Some of them do go back to school and get some schooling and might have psychology degrees, but they don't have actual applied clinical experience in the field of psychology. So they're taking the formula that their unit has built and perfected and becoming experts in that. not to say that they don't listen to psychologists, because they absolutely do. I was at a behavioral analysis seminar at the FBI last year, and they were quoting some of the best sex offender research out there. And I was so happy that they were on top of it and knew who all the top experts were. But forensic psychology is going to be anywhere where psychology and the legal system intersect. And it's vast. It could be doing child custody evaluations. It could be doing jury selection for attorneys. It's wherever those two worlds connect. A lot of people are just in private practice, and they are experts hired to do evaluations that will someday be in court. So forensic psychology is a huge umbrella, and criminal profilers definitely are more of a niche, and generally they're law enforcement officers.
It's also, it used to be, what we do used to be considered such a soft science. And what Dr. Shiloh is talking about is, we just every year get more and more data that then gets quantified so that, we're able, like an analyst for a police department who can tell you, hey, if you're going after this he's going to be in this area. We're able to now do that on a macro level with offenders in just amazing ways that wouldn't have been able to been done 20 years ago, because we have so much data now.
Wow. Interesting.
So obviously with the case that we're talking about today, we're talking about the possibility of a staged homicide. Have you guys ever come close to handling a case like that in your professional lives or on the podcast?
No, I have not from a forensic psych point of view. Law enforcement wise, I kind of treated every dead body I went to like a potential homicide, just for accurate collection of evidence and notes on my part. But again, just as a patrol officer, I used it as really good practice to treat everyone like that. But no, professionally, no staged homicides I've been asked to comment on.
Dr. Scott?
No, I haven't. I haven't, but now I'm completely fascinated by the entire concept after listening to your episodes. And both Shiloh and I were like looking at each other with our mouths open with Petler, who you've had on, like, who is just amazing. Boy, you scored a great guest in that. So I feel like I'm being educated on, another sliver of what we do. Yeah, I mean, I haven't had any direct experience in that, but it's fascinating.
All right. So obviously a big component that we're wondering about here is potential for this to have been a suicide versus being a staged homicide. Is it typical for someone that ends their own life to do so and have so many responsibilities and plans? I mean, Elisa had dogs that she was taking care of for her business. They belonged to other people. She had plans with her daughter literally the next morning to have breakfast. She had a friend that was flying out that week. She had her marriage that had literally just happened within the previous 12 hours. Does it kind of seem typical in suicide cases to have so many responsibilities?
A lot of what I do in my work is evaluating risk for suicidality. And I might be doing a pre-hospitalization interview, post-hospitalization interview. And although there is no hard, fast evaluation tool that is statistically validated so that we know, like, okay, this is the score we get. This person is suicidal. They're a danger to themselves. That doesn't exist. So we have to look at a lot of factors. And what you're talking about when you give that example is what we call future orientation. So when an individual is future oriented, they can exist in the same world. They can have an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. They can be frustrated. They can be depressed. Someone can have a terminal illness, but yet they can still be future oriented. I've got the responsibilities to my family. I'm depressed, but I really like my job. My daughter is depending on me, and so on and so on and so on. And future orientation is one of the major protective factors that we look at.
And when you say protective factor, what is that?
So there's a whole range of protective factors that would be inhibitors or that would keep someone from following through with a suicidal action. So other protective factors would be a strong support system, a strong sense of self-efficacy. I'm the captain of my ship. I know what I'm doing. Even though these other things are happening in my life, I feel like I have a sense of autonomy. I have future orientation. I have all of my sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are being met. I have a home. I have security. So we look at all of those. Shiloh, what else would you add to that picture?
I would say that future orientation comes into conflict with hopelessness, and hopelessness is the biggest red flag when you're evaluating someone who is suicidal. So if they don't think that there's a way out of their situation or that things will never get any better, that's a huge red flag when you're doing a risk assessment. And I think as an alternative to that, I don't want you to get one boxed in picture of what someone looks like when they're suicidal, because sometimes you never know. The people closest to them are completely shocked because they've kept it under wraps. And oftentimes when we interview survivors of suicide, just as unusual as it seems, they will say, I don't want to die. I want to just end the psychological pain. And that's the only way to do it because I've tried everything else. Or they think they have and they've lost hope. So it's a really interesting dynamic when you look at the variation of people who experience suicidal ideation, because there isn't one box that they fit in.
Are there any instances where somebody doesn't have suicidal tendencies, but they might have just acted out in that one moment impulsively without having sort of a background of talking about suicide or even,
right?
You know what I'm saying?
That's absolutely, I mean, there can be, an individual could be engaging in gestural activities we call suicidal gestures, or they might be acting out in a way, in a form of self-harm that fills another psychological need. But from what I know about statistics and the commission and sequelae of the suicidal process, it's not usual that the gesture is done by hanging. Does that make sense? So if you're going to make a gesture, you might overdose on a non-lethal medication, or you might make superficial cuts, or you might be experienced. And there are people who, do this on a regular basis because it's part of their emotional makeup. It might be these suicidal gestures might actually be an emotional coping mechanism. It's not a healthy one, but it's a coping mechanism. And they might know how to cut just enough and just how deep to not end their lives. So yes, to answer your question, it can happen by accident without the intent of actually hurting themselves. But I don't see where it's just not, I can't even think of an example where someone was making a gesture of hanging themselves. They might put something around their neck, or they might hang something from the ceiling as if in preparation, but then standing on a stool or a chair, putting it around their neck, that is very rare.
Now, and just to touch off that, because this is something I think we started talking about early on, if she wanted to make some kind of statement, being as artistic as she was, something that would shock and, stick with whoever found her, assuming it was maybe Brad she was angry with and whatever, with her creativity, would that be something that might make her take her own life in that manner?
I don't have I can't answer that, I think, in the way that you want me to answer it. I mean, but I do think that you're hitting on something that's very important about who she is as an individual, and that is that she's an artist. But that speaks to different levels, different examples of how she has expressed her emotionality, especially with, your iconic image of the silence painting. But I think what you're almost like implying that maybe this was like performance art type of expression. I don't know if I'm wrong in saying that, but it doesn't seem like that would be likely. Shiloh, what do you think?
I agree with you. I think it's just too hard to say. I mean, there could be that outlier where she did that. But I wanted to go back and comment on what Gray was asking about with impulsivity, because when there are substances involved, and most commonly alcohol, it doesn't have to be narcotics, people take their lives when they're under the influence. Their inhibitions are down. They're making some very permanent decisions impulsively, to which they think will fix their problem in the moment and or end the psychological pain that they're feeling. So depending on her intoxication level that night, impulsivity is a very real thing that could have been happening.
So let me also piggyback on what Dr. Shiloh was saying. And this is something that, pricked up my ears in I believe it was your first episode, where you shared that she had been diagnosed with lupus. So now, once again, I'm not a medical doctor. However, my training as a psychologist has me informed as to medical conditions that can have expression as emotional challenges. And lupus is, primarily, as far as I know, primarily it exhibits in women. It ends up being incredibly painful and life-altering for those who are diagnosed with it. And it is very common. If you do some even basic research on lupus, you'll see that the biggest challenges in that medical condition are depression and anxiety. And there's a lot of debate in the medical community about where does that come from? Does the lupus actually cause a physiological change in the body that then manifests as anxiety and depression? Or is it those emotional states, are they due to the medications that are used to manage the condition? And the medications that are used to manage the condition are steroids to manage inflammation. Steroids of that type, which are different from anabolic steroids and different from corticosteroids, definitely can cause anxiety. They can cause serious depression. And then also, I believe in one of the screenings or the blood tests, they revealed that she was on a low dose of amphetamines. So if she was on Adderall or Ritalin or anything in that drug class, that might have been prescribed legitimately to help lift her out of depression. But the other side effect of having that in your system is increasing anxiety. Now, what Shiloh was talking about is that now when other substances come into play, you put alcohol on top of something that's a really strong stimulant, that absolutely can increase impulsivity. We're not saying that's what happened, but these are factors that if we're looking at a case, we're going to look at all of those factors and see where they come into play.
And just to jump back to something real quick that you mentioned before, the build up to sometimes to someone taking their own life. You mentioned they could be cutting themselves, doing things like that. What about in Elisa's case, where she threatened to do it, whether it was serious or not, in an argument with Brad? What do you guys think of that leading up to this event?
Yeah, I mean, we have a gesture there where we know that she was acting because she was hooping in Sharon as part of this story that they wanted to convince Brad that she was overdosing on Advil, if I recall correctly. And in that, which you can see in the text messages, she had also set up a story that she had written letters for her family and that they would be on the dresser and she was going to sign everything over to Brad and all this. But we know that, at least according to the communication, it looks like that this was all just kind of a hoax. She was trying to get him to come home, essentially, because he was out partying and doing what he would do when he would be away from the home. And she really felt like the only way that she could bring him back to reality was to get him back in the house. So What are your thoughts
and even
on
in
that?
I think their very first argument over text that we see, she talks about going and jumping off a bridge the next day. So she's already using the language, and then it builds up to this elaborate fake plan with another person involved. So Scott, did you want to talk about hypomania a little bit? And maybe that fits in there.
Yeah. So thanks, Shiloh, for bringing that back around. Because when we talk about these things, we want to be so respectful to the individual. And, you guys have painted such an amazing, profound, and three-dimensional picture of her. And in the interviews with her mom, this is a wonderful person. She was a wonderful, energetic person. You sit and watch those interviews with her sister, and the tears that come out in her recall of her energy. It's kind of amazing. But when I listen to that, or not and when I listen to that, one of the things that occurs to me is, that level of energy for so many years, and the examples of, as a child, sort of really pushing the boundary with her family, like the duck episode. Like, it's cute, it's adorable, and we laugh about it, but that's really pushing. That's really that's not really within the boundaries of most kids' developmental behaviors at that age. And, all of this energy of, I'm going to take the dance classes, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, going back and forth, really kind of paints a picture for me of sort of a state called hypomania. And hypomania is sort of the active stage of cyclothymia, which is what we would kind of call, and I'll probably get flack from other psychologists for this, but it's like bipolar light. So it's sort of, if the general range of people's moods is this, hypomania is just enhanced. It's not incredible mania that goes all the way up, and severe depression that goes all the way down. But hypomania is these moments of like bursts of energy that last for days. And I'm going to do this project, and I'm going to do this project, and then switching gears and focusing on something else. And that does lend to the idea that maybe she was a somewhat impulsive person.
I think you definitely hit on it. Manic episodes is when we see this to the nth degree, and she's not quite there. She's not exhibiting traits like someone with mania or bipolar, but a lot of what she's exhibiting is similar to someone who may have hypomania, which I don't want to repeat exactly what Scott said, but it could also sort of tap into some of the mood swings that we see with the text messaging, which I know we're going to talk about later, but gives us a real good window into where her mind's at sort of in the moment, and not in real time, but these years later.
We will be right back after this break.
A lot of us struggle with finding happiness, dealing with tough life issues, and so much more. But you don't have to struggle alone, and you don't even have to leave your home to get the help you need, thanks to BetterHelp Online Counseling.
BetterHelp is available on desktop or mobile for both Android or iOS. You can speak to a counselor via text, chat, phone, or video.
Find secure, convenient, professional help that's affordable with BetterHelp.
BetterHelp isn't a crisis line, but you can find licensed professional counselors that you can speak to from the comfort of your own home.
3 Men and a Mystery listeners get 10% off your first month with discount code 3MEN. So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/3men. Financial aid is available to those who qualify. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's betterhelp.com/3men. Find help to break through those personal obstacles with BetterHelp. Welcome back, and please keep in mind that our sponsors are helping us raise funds that will go towards investigating this case further and honoring the life of Elisa Gomez, which you guys will hear about in the next episode. We have a really good plan for that. So please show them the same support that they're showing us. Now let's continue with Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott from LA Not So Confidential. All right, shifting the conversation a little bit, starting to look more in Brad's direction. Something that was clear from the texts for me was alcohol and drug use. And in particular, alcohol seems to be a very strong motivating factor for him. We know he has a past with domestic violence issues. Can you give us a little insight into how alcohol and drugs might fuel domestic violence issues, how that works together?
So when we're looking at specifically intimate partner violence, and I just want to be specific because domestic violence now can include anyone living under the same household, siblings, parent, child, if they're adults. So in intimate partner relationships and violence, substance abuse is a huge risk factor for that taking place. There's several other risk factors. The ones that jump out to me for Brad are past violent behaviors, which is classic. We talk about that all the time in psychology, right? The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And anytime I'm doing a risk assessment for violence or a sexual offender, it's going to include looking at that history because it's so highly correlated with future violence. So those absolutely stick out to me. His substance abuse is pretty evident from the get-go with her. Within a couple of weeks of knowing each other, she's helping him hide his alcohol. He's talking openly about just cleaning the house and drinking and being drunk while he's tipsy. He's definitely letting her know that that's a big part of his life.
Yeah, as far as the substance use in his case, I think that takes a second fiddle to what he is characterologically. He just fits this. I don't want to necessarily use the profile, but he's hitting so many points on the scale of someone who engages in intimate partner violence. And that's another thing that confounds this for me, although it starts to confound me because you want to go, how did this wonderful woman end up with this guy? But what we know is that people who are perpetrators of intimate partner violence have a way of pulling their victims into that cycle. They can take the strongest person in the world and bring them into this coercive control cycle and begin that. The thing that surprised me about all this is how rapidly it happens. Like, this is such a short time for this toxic relationship to go so deep and so dangerous. I don't feel like I have enough information regarding her substance use, because it doesn't seem like there's any really long-term history of it. But certainly, like Dr. Shiloh was saying, with him, it just seems like it's literally just another checkbox off his profile.
When you mentioned the background that he has with abuse, is it just abuse in general, or is it the specific kind of abuse where he has with a history of strangling or choking his partners?
Was there anything in his criminal history about violence, like with other men, like a fight or assaults or things of that nature?
No. Everything was pretty much, driving infractions and drinking. And, in particular, he strangled an ex-wife and was charged and served time for that. We've heard of a couple of other stories with women that had relationships with him where they were also choked. You haven't heard this episode because it hasn't been released as of when we're recording this, but his ex-wife actually wrote in her statement that wound up in the court records that she was convinced that he would wind up killing someone.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. There's women before Elisa and then after Elisa that have fallen victim to strangulation behaviors with him. And strangulation behaviors specifically are such a precursor to intimate partner homicide. There was a study done out of San Diego County here in California by the DA's office And they looked at 300 near fatal cases where strangulation was involved. And then through a larger portion of their study, they were able to look at women who were strangled at least once were 750 times more likely to die by the hands of their intimate partner. So it's a huge correlation. And I think with him, and more to answer your question, we're seeing a very narrowed way in which his violence is manifesting. He's not out there picking fights with other guys at bars or getting in sort of those types of altercations. It's with the women in his life.
Yeah, definitely for criminal charges. I know in the text messages, I did see a few references to him wanting to, beat up someone or chasing someone down or something like that. But for charges, yeah, nothing around that. So you both listened to the interview that Brad had with the detectives on the day that Elisa was found. Did you have any takeaways from that interview? What were your impressions?
So we're always very cautious to judge, and I know you guys have hit on this, about people's behavior and grief and under extreme stressful situations. So let's strip away our preconceived notions of him as a human being and just think about the situation that he's in. If he didn't cause it, and even if he did, it's still traumatic. It is extremely stressful, whether he's guilty or not. And there is grief that is there, as callous as we want to put him or not. All of those elements are there. And there is something to say you cannot judge someone by how they're acting in a complex traumatic situation and or a grief situation. So I am very hesitant to comment on it as a professional, as a person with feelings and looking at it and feeling like I can watch a police interview or interrogation and kind of call the guilt or innocence by that. I have some strong feelings towards the way he's reacting, but that's not based on research and science. I will also add, I think the interviewer, the detective, put a fair amount of pressure on him for it being simply an investigative interview.
Right.
It didn't rise to the level of interrogation at that point. And I think it would have been nice to have some follow through on some other questions.
Yeah.
But he was definitely stressed out by being there and what was going on and what was being asked of him.
Well, and if you look at his criminal history, I mean, it's obvious. This guy doesn't have a good time when the cops are around. So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I would also, I second everything that Dr. Shiloh says. The only thing that I would add to it is what's notable to me is inconsistency. And, it just seems that now, like, there's a lot of factors, there's not a lot of follow through on certain questions, but that inconsistency in some of his answers was notable to me, much as if we come back around to Sharon. Is it Sharon? Sharon's her name? Mm-hmm. I mean, we can talk about that a little bit later if we have time, but, that's another thing that's notable about her as a part of this exploration is just, it's muddying the waters to have someone who constantly changes their story. But we have to be very careful about judging some people under duress because people act in very odd ways. It's one of the things we've talked about this several times on our podcast. Shiloh and I get very frustrated in cases where we hear judges making sort of these blanket statements of you're showing no emotion and you're, just sort of making a statement on what this person's presenting after they've been through 9 months of preparing for a trial and their family's sitting out there and everybody's under a lot of stress. It's just not a fair comparison to make at that point in time.
Yeah. What is the norm at that point?
Right.
Yeah.
And how would you find your baseline at this point?
Well, you see that a lot on social media. People think that they're, psychoanalysts. They're looking at the interviews that maybe the media is giving somebody that everybody considers a suspect. And if they don't look exactly the way they think he's supposed to look, or she, then they start going, oh, look at that. He looked to the left. He looked to the right. He blinked right there. They come up with all this stuff. And it gets really frustrating. So you have people being accused of crimes when it turns out they didn't even do anything at the end. They just acted differently than the norm that you thought was the norm.
And the media, like you said, I think you bring up a really good point, Gray, is like the media does this thing where, say someone is accused of something horrific, and the photographer happens to catch that one moment in time where they've got a slight smirk on their face. And then that photo becomes the icon that is used to substantiate this person's guilt, which is not fair. That's not supposed to be how our legal system works.
Yeah.
And yet that takes on life of its own, whether or not that person is guilty or innocent. That's not fair that it takes on a life of its own.
Kind of interesting that we're going to follow up with this question, because I know there is no norm in these situations, but you guys have much more experience with understanding how people work in situations like this. Assuming that Brad either ended her life or that she ended her life, what does the follow-up action tell us of him going into a heavy party lifestyle immediately after her death? We've got the house that is completely wrecked. He runs away from the cops. He winds up wrecking her car and then, trying to escape the situation. There's a lot of information that there was a lot of really crazy things happening in that house following her death. How does that work into a determination here?
Well, we know that alcohol is his drug of choice, and it doesn't surprise me either way that this is how he would choose to deal with a very stressful situation, whether it's self-induced because he caused her death or because it's his way of coping with grief. He obviously is not a good coper, a good decision maker, someone who has that amount of chronic alcohol and substance use might even have some frontal lobe brain damage from the substances that he's used. So that's going to be all of his executive functioning that is responsible for making good decisions. And all of that combined could look like something like this. His choice is just to party. I don't necessarily see it as like this party like celebration. But having said that, if we're going to take the other extreme and look at, is this person just psychopathic and does not care about what he just did and is sort of throwing it in her face, of the family's face, of zero remorse and just thinking about himself? I mean, if you had to do a one-line definition of a psychopath, that would be it. So it's really hard to say how that fits. I'm not familiar with any research in, how people specifically with this situation who have substance abuse problems necessarily deal with grief in terms of looking like they're having a party.
Yeah, we're also not talking about somebody that's noted to have good judgment anyway, right? So he could be an outlier. This could be, like Shiloh was saying, this could be his really, really poorly developed coping skill, or it could be an indicator of, some real antisocial tendencies.
Gotcha. I have been extremely close to this case for a long period of time now. And when I got the text records and started reading through them, I was amazed at seeing, kind of to your point earlier about how quick they got into really bad fights, how long those fights lasted. And there was something in me when I was reading them that I was like, she's starting to see it. She's going to get out of this relationship. Like, I had this hope that for some reason the text messages were going to show me that she actually leaves him and somehow she never died in the first place. I've never had this happen before. Reading those text messages, they just took me to such a bizarre place of really feeling even worse about what happened, because there was a lot of strong indicators that this relationship was not great from the start. But we sent the text messages to you guys. Can you give us what your thoughts are about that chain, that communication? What did you notice and see in it?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, I think Shiloh has more more direct about the content of the text. But in relation to what you just said, I wanted to reflect back on something that her sister shared that I think is very telling. And her sister said in the interview that she wanted to be married, and that like, just take that statement alone and think about it, that she wanted to be married, that she was at this age, what's going through her mind. And I think that, I mean, here we are, we're four guys, and, we have one woman here on the panel discussing this. And it may be hard for men sometimes to understand the cultural weight that has for women in Western society. But that need or that importance in her life seems to play a very important role. Shiloh, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with all of what you said, that could absolutely be possible and be what her narrative was. I also was very alarmed at how quickly this relationship is developing, and not just the relationship, because I don't want to judge that. People jump into relationships quickly, and that can be fine. I'm here to self-disclose. My husband and I were living together a month after we met, but we've been married for 15 years. Yeah. It can work out. It can be the right decision. And like they say, sometimes when you know. But the level of self-disclosure, you don't normally see that in a honeymoon phase of a relationship. I mean, I feel like they didn't even have a honeymoon phase. And when I say honeymoon phase, I mean, that's usually the first 6 months of a relationship where your endorphins are just going crazy and you're on a high and you're wanting to put your best foot forward and show this person that you're wonderful, because you want them to think you're wonderful because you think they're wonderful. And they're talking about MRSA and, having staph infection and alcoholism, and like all of their skeletons in their closet kind of are out in the first 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that was probably alarming to me. Like, what's going on here? What are the personality makeups of these two? And as I continue to read and see these long drawn out text message arguments, it just gave me a window into a toxic relationship like I've almost never had before. Because we can hear about it through a friend or a story or secondhand, but to feel like you're sitting in the car with them or sitting in the house with them while they're texting this back and forth, the toxicity just felt like it was seeping out of these messages.
Yeah, when things got bad, they went really bad, and for a long period of time.
And you mentioned that this was very fast, and that maybe goes back to Elisa being an impulsive person, like we talked about earlier. And I wonder how much of that is Brad being the big bad wolf that comes along and takes advantage of that and jumps into that, knowing that he can work that for what it's worth.
Well, you know what I didn't see was a ton of verbal manipulation by him in these. I didn't really see that cycle of violence. It's hard to explain. Like him trying to talk her into things or convince her of things or or even gaslighting necessarily. Yeah. It's just, they were both elevated and up, and then they were both just super nasty to each other, kind of meeting each other in these same places. So I think it makes sense more.
Wasn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, wasn't he pushing her on the wedding? Was that a little bit of a turnaround towards that, trying to control her a little bit?
Well, according to information from some people I've spoken to in the family, they are under the assumption that it was him that kind of led her down the aisle. And we had a strange situation going on there because they were talking about having like a full-blown wedding in April, and they were supposed to go to just get the license. But the reason he gives is, he says that, well, the license would only last for 6 months and it wasn't going to cover when their actual wedding came up. Well, then why go get the license? It's not a big deal to go get a license. So there was some type of factor that pushed them towards getting married at that point. I think from Elisa's point of view, she really had this thing that I saw in the text messages where whenever he would go out and start raging and partying, she wanted to pull him home. She always thought that getting him back in the house was like literally the answer, that, she couldn't do anything if he was out there partying, but if he was in the home, I think she felt like she could help him, and we saw that pattern from very early on. The doctors mentioned it, the pattern of, he thinks he can't control his own alcohol and she's hiding the alcohol from him. And that comes up in their fights even,
But why did she want to help him? Like him? I mean, he didn't seem like he had anything redeeming. I mean, I don't mean to sound, well, I do. I mean to sound mean. There didn't seem to be anything redeeming about the guy.
And I think that's her nature. I think she's the kind of person that is looking for that wounded puppy, that
Absolutely.
animal that needs comfort and aid, and I can help this puppy and bring it into my life and make
why
it better.
that puppy? That's what I'm saying.
Let's put it to the woman of this panel, Dr. Shiloh.
Yeah.
Can you give us some insight into this mentality that she would have been trying to save his life or make him a better person?
Well, as the token woman on this panel, I think it speaks. Morph kind of hit the nail on the head. She's a helper. It speaks to her personality. She loved to help other people or animals, and that's a fixer. That's someone who is so generous, but that can also be a red flag that they're not looking at their own stuff and what's going on with them. They're just preoccupied with fixing people around them. So I think it's more of her personality and makeup. And if she was struggling with any sort of underlying mental illness that wasn't super obvious, more than, necessarily just being a woman. I don't know what her relationship was like with her father too much. There is kind of the old adage that, women try to fix men that sort of mimic the negative behaviors they've seen in their own fathers. But that's getting a little psychodynamic for me, even.
Sure. All right. So you saw a bunch of the information. I know you've listened to several of the episodes. Did you see any severe warning signs that Elisa had suicidal ideations?
I would say I didn't see any severe warning signs. No, there was nothing from the information that I have that I would say this woman needs a risk assessment for suicidal ideation.
I completely agree. Even with the sort of dramatic proclamations that she was making and the statements, that doesn't, to me, reach the level of someone taking that next step. I mean, like we said, there's always the possibility of that outlier that acts impulsively and is able to complete the action. But this just doesn't. And this gets into where we kind of move away from quantifiable statistics. I mean, there's an art to what we do. It doesn't feel right.
Right.
It just doesn't feel right.
To flip it on the other side, Dr. Scott, is Brad the type of person that would show up as a case file on your desk?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, this is somebody that would have been, called multiple times, that would have had 911 called on him multiple times for DV or intimate partner violence, or, his own actions in the community while under the influence of substances. And yeah, that fits the profile perfectly.
I think the biggest question that you guys can really help us with, this is something that is just kind of a personal dream for me because of my close contact with the family. Is there any way that they find closure in this? We've got a case where the medical examiner won't say it's a homicide, won't say it's a suicide. It's stuck. It could not be determined. We've got a police department that has basically brushed the file off their desk. They think they have their thoughts about it, and that's about that. How does this family find closure in this? How do they move forward?
It's really difficult. What the scenario you're describing is one of the worst case scenarios. I mean, one of the things I would say is when we're providing support to families, or when I'm in my private practice, when I'm helping people work through grief, is that, we all want an answer that will give us relief, that will give us a reason for why something happened. And that's predicated on the belief that understanding why will make us feel better. And that's not always accurate. If it was just like if it all flipped tomorrow and they were able to say it was a suicide or it was a homicide, the idea of having that answer probably is something they fantasize about giving them relief. But I can tell you from my experience, it doesn't give the relief that you want it to, unfortunately. I think it's important to, while this is in this flux or in this gray area that may never be resolved, you have a choice as an individual and as a family of whether or not you're going to try and move forward. And what I would say in trying to move forward is do what you can to honor her memory and honor the love that clearly everyone feels for her. To this day, there's such strong emotion around who she was as a person and what she gave back to those around her. That's what I would say focus on. I'm not saying don't push to try and get an answer on what happened, but those are two separate entities. One is the emotional relief versus getting sort of the justification and the understanding for what happened. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really think you hit some very strong points there. I'm really happy that we got to that. Dr. Shiloh, do you have any comments to add to that?
I think that was phrased really well by Dr. Scott. I would just add that I think this case is completely solvable. It's going to be the cooperation of the other people who were there that night. And that may come with time. It may be a long time before the family knows or hears the truth, but I think there are some major things in people's lives that can move them to want to come forward finally and tell the story. And so either it's going to be something like that, or it's going to be new investigators taking a fresh look and trying to turn over some new stones.
I was going to say, I often say on my show that I don't believe in that there's even such a thing as closure when it involves someone dying. I think it's more you're able to learn to live with it, but maybe you need to close that chapter of the story out by getting an answer, but you'll never have closure to their death, and you just learn to live with it better.
I completely agree. Yeah, everybody says closure, but nobody ever sits down and tries to define what that term means, right?
Right.
So you and I might have very wildly different ideas of what closure means. For someone, closure might mean that I don't ever think about this again, or that I'm not going to be sad, or I'm not going to miss, my mother who died 3 years ago. That's sort of, it's like this sort of nebulous thing that everybody's trying to hold on to. And that's something that I think that is really helpful for people that are going through, is like they need a counselor, whether it's a grief counselor or a pastoral counselor, a minister, a therapist, to work through that and realize that closure, why would you want closure? Why would you want to close the door on the loss of someone you loved instead of cherishing that memory and understanding that that person is part of you and you're never going to lose that. You never want to lose that person or that loss, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a grief expert and researcher named David Kessler. And some people might have heard him on the Confronting O.J. Simpson podcast. He was a guest on there. And I've seen him speak many times, and I know him. And people constantly ask him, how long is this going to hurt? How long am I going to grieve? And he comes back at them with, how long is your loved one going to be dead? And it's kind of a blunt way to say it, but it's going to hurt forever. And it is about healing and sort of that new normal that you're talking about, Gray.
Yeah, and what's hard is to heal when there's no resolution. Now, like I had a brother that died, and it took me about 2 years to sort of get back to a sort of a normal living, but he's always in my mind. But I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have, if he had died and there was no reason why, and that was still up in the air the whole time. It seems like it would just kind of keep you in this perpetual state of grieving almost, where you can never quite get past that. Is that something that you've come across where it's not a solved case?
Definitely. There's no resolve. There's no, with death, no matter what kind of death it is, why is always there, even if it is a terminal illness. Why this person? Why now? There's always going to be why. And people in the positions like Elisa's family that don't have the answer, or people that don't have a body to their missing loved one, they often comment on it's like that wound is just open and can't start healing.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Shiloh, Dr. Scott, you have given such amazing information and insights. We so appreciate your time. Thank you so much for all the work it took in terms of coming to understand this case and for spending time with us. Everyone out there, please be sure to check out their work on LA Confidential. And where can people find you?
So people can find our podcast on all major podcatchers. On Twitter, we're at LA Not So Pod. Instagram, we're at LA Not So Podcast. And we're on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. And then we have a website where we do all of our resources like good little psychologists. We have probably more journal articles than anyone ever wants to read. And our website is la-not-so-confidential.com.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shiloh. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. I really hope we get to work together again someday. There's some talk, I'm just going to put a little bug out there, about us working together again at CrimeCon. Whenever that happens, we'll see. But I really hope it comes together. I can't wait to work with you guys again.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Looking forward.
Take care.
Thanks for the opportunity.
You got it. And for anyone out there, if you are struggling with thoughts of ending your own life, please don't hesitate. Call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. It's there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And please join us for the finale live stream on Wednesday, April 8th at 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern on my channel, Gray Hughes Investigates. And make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell.
If you want to find out more about our show, you can do that over at www.threemenandamystery.com, and that's with the number 3.
If you have any feedback, corrections, or new details, you can send them to us via email at threemenandamystery.com. That's with the number 3. Or you can reach out to us on Twitter. Our handle is 3 Men and a Mystery, or find us on Facebook.
3 Men and a Mystery is produced by John Lorden, Mike Morford, and Gray Hughes.
Please be sure to rate us on the podcasting platform that you found us on and help us grow by telling your friends and family about us.
Don't miss the final episode of Season 2, streamed live at Gray Hughes Investigates. We'll be sharing some new info and the latest developments. Yes, there's still stuff we haven't covered with you guys yet. We're also taking your comments and questions via chat, possibly even taking a few phone calls. We'll be there on April 8th, and the live stream will be released on the podcast feed the following day. I'm John Lorden.
I'm Mike Morford.
And I'm Gray Hughes.
And we are 3 Men and a Mystery.